In every era, there are stories people whisper about but never dare to speak aloud. Stories buried so deep in the shadows of history that even the archives tremble at their mention. Tonight we open a door most historians refuse to touch, a door leading back to New Orleans in 1840, a city glittering with wealth, rotting with secrets, and ruled by men who believed they could buy anything, even a life touched by something beyond the natural world. What you are about to hear is not a tale of romance or glamour. It is a haunting reminder of the cruelty humans once practiced and the dark mysteries that sometimes rose out of that cruelty to challenge the world itself. New Orleans in 1840 was a city that breathed in two different rhythms at once, one of elegance and one of decay. By day, its streets sparkled with the illusion of prosperity, carriages rolling beside polished storefronts, merchants calling out their goods, and the distant chiming of church bells mixing with the humid breeze that drifted in from the river. But when the sun began to lower behind the cypress trees and the mist rose heavy over the French Quarter, the city revealed its other face, the face only locals truly understood. In that darkness, the whispers of old spirits moved like wind through the alleyways, and the legacy of suffering and secrets hung in the air so thick that even light seemed to slow down when it passed through. The booming trade and culture made New Orleans wealthy, but beneath that wealth pulsed a shadow system of illegal markets, hidden auctions, and backroom dealings where the city's darkest appetites thrived without interruption. In these secret corners, the highest bidders weren't interested in cotton, silver, or tobacco. They sought something more rare, something they could not find in any public ledger or legal transaction, something that the law pretended did not exist but everyone with power knew had existed for decades. The atmosphere of the city was shaped not only by its commerce, but by its folklore. Stories of curses, spirits, and ancient rituals were not dismissed as superstition. They were treated with a wary respect, as if everyone sensed that the veil between the living and the dead was thinner here. Fires burned longer in this place. Shadows lingered in doorways as though waiting to be invited inside. People born in the city claimed they could feel the difference in the air, a strange pressure that settled on their chests at night, as though unseen eyes watched them from the rooftops. Travelers often spoke about nightmares they couldn't explain, dreams filled with faces they had never seen, and rooms they had never entered. Even the most rational scholars admitted quietly that the city felt alive in a way others did not. It was within this eerie blend of wealth, mystery, and superstition that secret auctions found their home, hidden behind tall shutters guarded by men whose loyalty was purchased with coin rather than conscience. These auctions catered to the elite who believed themselves untouchable. They sought rare things, forbidden things, things that could only be obtained through shadows. Some of the auctions trafficked in objects stolen from across the world, artifacts with carvings that scholars refused to translate, relics wrapped in cloth so old it crumbled when touched. But the most lucrative markets dealt in human lives, and these underground gatherings attracted men whose greed was matched only by their obsession with power. They watched with hungry eyes for anything that seemed unusual, anything that hinted at secrets or abilities not easily explained by the laws of nature. Rumors spread quickly in New Orleans, and soon there were murmurs about a particular upcoming auction that carried a different kind of tension. Patrons whispered about it behind closed doors, stepping closer to one another as though afraid the walls might be listening. They said the organizers had found someone extraordinary, someone so rare that even the most seasoned traders struggled to describe her. There was talk of a young woman whose presence alone altered the air, causing lantern flames to waver and metal objects to vibrate when she passed. Some said she spoke languages no one had heard before, not in any church, not in any book. Others claimed she carried scars shaped like symbols on her palms, symbols no doctor could identify. The stories were vague, fragmented, and often contradictory, yet they all shared the same tone, fear mixed with fascination. On the night of the auction, the tension in the city shifted. Even those who had no knowledge of the gathering felt a disturbance, like a trembling beneath the surface of the earth. Dogs barked without reason. Candles flickered in churches that had been empty for hours. A warm wind rose from the river, heavy with the scent of smoke, though no fire could be found. Those attending the auction arrived cloaked and silent, their carriages stopping in an alley rather than the main street. Inside the hidden chamber, the air felt thicker than usual, almost too heavy to breathe. The men gathered there leaned forward in their chairs, waiting for something they could not name, sensing that whatever would be presented that night did not belong in this world of commerce and greed. The underground auctioneer, a man hardened by years of dealing in forbidden trade, seemed uncharacteristically tense as he prepared the room. He glanced often at the door behind him, as if unsure whether he had made a mistake bringing this particular soul into a space built on the buying and selling of lives. The usual noise, the casual chatter that filled these gatherings, was replaced by a stiff silence. No one dared to speak above a whisper, and even the whispers faded when the torches on the walls began to dim for no explainable reason. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The bidders, who prided themselves on fearlessness, felt something unfamiliar crawling up their spines. Some swore the shadows in the corners stretched farther than they should have, reaching toward the center of the room in long, unnatural shapes. None of them knew then that this night would become the origin of one of the most disturbing legends in the city's history, a legend that would travel through decades as a whisper carried on humid winds, warning those who dared to chase forbidden power that some mysteries come with a price far greater than any man could afford to pay. She appeared in the chamber with a silence so deep it stole the breath from every man present. No chains rattled, no footsteps echoed, no whispered command announced her entrance. One moment the room held only anxious bidders and dim torchlight, and the next she stood there as if she had simply materialized from the darkness itself. Her presence unsettled the space in ways the men could not describe. The air around her felt colder, and the faint smell of something earthy drifted through the chamber like damp soil after heavy rain. She was young, slender, and calm in a way that did not match the cruelty of her circumstances. Her stillness was not fear or resignation. It was something older, something self-contained, as if she carried an entire world within her that no one in that room could understand. Her captors did not speak. They kept several feet behind her, avoiding her shadow, refusing to meet her eyes. These were men accustomed to handling people like merchandise, men who prided themselves on control and authority, yet none of them dared touch her. The bidders noticed this immediately. It was the first thing that made their skin prickle. They had seen men drag terrified souls onto platforms before, but this time the handlers stood back as if they had been warned or perhaps threatened by something they could not resist. When she lifted her head, her gaze was slow and deliberate, passing over each face without flinching, yet not searching for help either. There was no desperation in her, no confusion, only a depth that forced every man to look away the moment her eyes met theirs. Her features were striking, but not in the way the bidders expected. She was not dressed in silks or adorned for spectacle. Her beauty was not crafted. It was raw, untamed, and unsettling. Her skin carried a warm tone, smoother than the torchlight should have allowed. Her hair fell in thick, dark waves down her back, untouched by the frantic preparations that usually accompanied these underground displays. The most unsettling part, however, was the faint shimmer along her forearms, a thin pattern of lines that resembled markings rather than scars. They were too symmetrical to be accidental and too faint to be painted. When the light shifted, the markings appeared to pulse like something alive beneath the surface of her skin. A low murmur spread through the room as men leaned closer, trying to decide whether they were witnessing an illusion or something they had no language for. The auctioneer attempted to speak, but his voice faltered, and the first words he uttered came out strained. He described her in simple, practical terms, as though listing traits would somehow make her less mysterious. But the bidders were not listening to him. Their attention lay entirely on her, trying to understand why her presence felt heavy, why the torches flickered each time she exhaled, and why the shadows deepened at her feet as if drawn to her. Rumors had already spread about her strange abilities, but seeing her in person made the whispers feel inadequate. One man seated near the front shifted uncomfortably, remembering the story of a trader who had tried to bind her wrists, only to find himself paralyzed for several minutes afterward, unable to speak or blink. Another man recalled hearing that, when she passed by reflective surfaces, her reflection either lagged slightly behind her movement or disappeared altogether. No two stories matched, yet each carried a thread of fear that now made sense in the oppressive atmosphere of the chamber. Her calmness was the most disturbing aspect. People brought to these auctions trembled, protested, screamed, or cried in silence. She did none of that. She stood with a composure that seemed unnatural for someone facing such cruelty. The bidders could not tell whether she was detached, resigned, or simply unafraid. That uncertainty gnawed at them. Her stillness felt like the warning before a storm, the quiet moment where the world seems to hold its breath. Some men felt a faint pressure in their skulls as she looked at them, like a sound too low to hear but too deep to ignore. A few pressed their palms to their temples, pretending they were simply tired from the long evening. When she finally spoke, the room froze. Her voice was low and smooth, almost musical, but layered with an accent none of the men recognized. It wasn't French, English, Creole, or any of the dialects familiar to New Orleans. It carried the cadence of a tongue far older, something rooted in lands and traditions the men of the city had never encountered. She said only a few words, and though no one understood them, the meaning pressed into their bones like cold fingers. The torches nearest her dimmed to the point where their flames shrank, curling inward as though recoiling from her presence. One of the bidders swore he saw a faint ripple through the floorboards beneath her bare feet, though no one else dared confirm it aloud. The auctioneer, sweating through his collar, attempted to regain control of the room, but every man's attention remained locked on the strange young woman. Some were captivated by the idea of possessing someone so rare, someone wrapped in secrets they could unravel. Others were troubled by the sense that she was not meant to be contained at all. The lines on her arms pulsed again, faint but unmistakable, as if responding to the greed swelling in the chamber. A soft hum filled the air, subtle and barely audible, causing the fine glassware on the back table to tremble in rhythm. The men stared at her with a mixture of awe and dread, realizing that whatever she was, she did not belong in their world of trade and power, and yet they could not look away, drawn to her presence like moths, drawn to a flame they did not understand. The first household that took her in learned quickly that whatever they believed they were purchasing that night was not what crossed their threshold. The wealthy sugar merchant who claimed her did so with the confidence of a man who thought money could tame anything, even the unexplained. But his confidence began to falter almost immediately. On her first night in the grand estate, the servants reported a strange hum traveling through the corridors, so faint it sounded like the distant vibration of metal strings, yet strong enough to rattle the glass cabinet doors in the dining hall. The merchant dismissed their concerns, but by morning he found every mirror in the house turned backward against the wall. Not broken, not moved violently, simply turned around, as if someone had walked through the home in the night with steady hands and absolute intention. The servants insisted it wasn't them, and she had never left the small room where she had been placed. Still, her calm expression in the morning light unsettled everyone, especially when she looked at the reversed mirrors with no surprise at all. Within days, the patterns began to repeat. Items went missing only to reappear in places they should not have fit, as though the laws of space had bent to accommodate some invisible force. A silver hairbrush found wedged inside a drawer too narrow to hold it. A candle discovered inside a locked chest no one had opened in years. The merchant grew irritated, believing his staff was playing tricks or losing their minds, but none of them would go near the young woman's quarters after dusk. They claimed they heard whispers through the wood of the door, not spoken by one voice, but layered like several speaking at once, soft and rhythmic, forming words that dissolved the moment they tried to recall them. The merchant's wife lasted only 6 days before demanding the girl be removed from the sleeping quarters entirely. She claimed that each night she woke to the sensation of someone standing at the foot of her bed, but when she lit her lamp, the room remained empty, except for the faintest impression on the rug, as though someone barefoot had just taken a step back into the shadows. The wife also noticed symbols beginning to form on the frost of her window panes, not drawn by hand, but appearing naturally, like condensation shaping itself into patterns that matched the faint markings on the young woman's arms. Hoping distance would restore peace, the merchant had her relocated to a storage house on the back side of the estate. Yet the disturbances did not fade. Instead, they multiplied. Servants delivering food refused to enter the building after claiming they heard breathing that did not belong to any living creature. At night, the windows of the storage house glowed with a soft blue light, but when anyone approached, the glow vanished abruptly, leaving the room dark and undisturbed. The merchant, determined to assert control, visited the building himself one night. He returned pale, shaking, and unable to speak of what he had seen. But from that night forward, he forbade anyone from entering the storage house except her. Word of the chaos traveled quickly to the underground circle of men who had attended the secret auction. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration or hysteria, but others were drawn in by the reports of markings glowing faintly under torchlight and the persistent rumors that she spoke to unseen presences. A second buyer stepped forward, eager to take her from the merchant, convinced he could harness whatever strange force surrounded her. But the moment she crossed the threshold of her new home, the events intensified. This second residence was smaller, a quiet townhouse close to the French Quarter, yet the sounds that echoed through it were anything but quiet. Doors opened by themselves, not swiftly or with force, but slowly, deliberately, as though someone unseen stood on the other side and pushed them open with care. The new owner awoke one night to find every door in his home standing open, even the ones he had locked. He walked room to room calling out, but the house remained silent except for a faint rhythmic tapping coming from behind the walls, following him wherever he went. The tapping stopped only when he reached her room, and when he opened the door, she sat awake in the darkness, her eyes reflecting light from no identifiable source. Objects began appearing in patterns throughout the house, small piles of salt arranged in precise circles, feathers placed in straight lines across the floor, knots of twine resting on windowsills. The owner believed she was responsible, though he never once saw her leave her room at night. Yet the symbols were too perfect, too symmetrical, too intentional for coincidence. When he tried to remove them, they reappeared by morning exactly as they had been before, undisturbed, as though the house itself insisted on restoring them. Neighbors began to complain of strange movements in the windows at night, claiming they saw silhouettes shifting behind the curtains, even when only one person lived in the townhouse. Some reported hearing a woman humming an unfamiliar melody, one that echoed through the narrow streets long after the lamps were extinguished. And yet, every time someone approached the home, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the smell of burning herbs drifting from somewhere unknown. The owner's health deteriorated rapidly. Sleep eluded him. Food turned to ash in his mouth. He claimed something watched him constantly, not her, but something that lingered in the corners of his rooms, something that grew stronger each day she stayed. When he asked her what followed them, she only tilted her head slightly, as though listening to a distant voice he could not hear. She offered no explanation and no warning, but the marks on her arms glowed faintly one night as he begged her to speak, causing the candles to extinguish in unison and the entire house to fall into absolute darkness. The final household that attempted to take her in never lasted long enough to share details. They left the property abruptly after only 3 nights, abandoning furniture, valuables and belongings, claiming the walls had begun whispering their names and that shadows moved independently of any light source. They reported that time itself seemed to shift in the home, clocks slowing, speeding up, or stopping entirely whenever she passed. With each attempt to claim her, the pattern became unmistakable. She did not resist physically, but the spaces she entered twisted around her, revealing a presence that did not belong to the world of men who sought to possess her. Those who tried to own her found themselves confronting forces they could neither explain nor escape, trapped in a growing realization that the young woman carried something far beyond their understanding. Something that reacted to greed and control like a warning whispered from the other side of the veil. Decades later, long after the last known sighting of the mysterious young woman, the legend surrounding her had grown into something the city spoke of only in fragments. Most refused to discuss it at all, as if the very memory carried an echo that might awaken whatever had trailed behind her. Yet in 1897, a historian named Elias Corbin arrived in New Orleans, determined to uncover the truth. He had heard whispers of a forbidden auction that had taken place half a century earlier, an event so shrouded in secrecy that even those who lived through it pretended it had never occurred. Corbin was a quiet man, disciplined and relentless, the sort who valued documents over stories and trusted written evidence more than human memory. But what he found in New Orleans challenged every rule he had built his life upon, pulling him into a maze of censored records, missing testimonies, and strange footnotes that seemed to vanish each time he tried to follow them. His investigation began in the city archives, where he expected to find at least a few hints buried in old ledgers or estate documents. But the records from the 1840s were incomplete, in a way that felt deliberate. Pages had been torn out of entire volumes, leaving ragged edges that suggested haste rather than deterioration. Several inventories of the city's wealthiest families contained blank spaces where names should have been. The archivist, a pale woman with a wary gaze, warned him that some things in the city's past were missing for everyone's protection. Corbin dismissed her warning, believing he had encountered similar evasions in other cities, but he sensed a different weight here, as though the silence surrounding this particular chapter of history had a pulse of its own. One day, while combing through a dusty stack of confiscated estate ledgers, Corbin found an anomaly. A handwritten note tucked inside one of the books bore a name that had appeared in several whispered stories. The sugar merchant, who was said to have been the first to bring the strange young woman into his home. The note was unsigned and undated, yet its ink was darker and newer than the fragile pages surrounding it. It read only a few lines describing a girl with markings and a house that began breathing, but Corbin felt a chill as he read it. The handwriting trembled, not with age but with fear, as though whoever wrote it had been too afraid to record anything more. He then learned of a private collection kept by a retired judge whose grandfather had lived during the time of the secret auction. The judge was reluctant to speak, but eventually allowed Corbin access to several sealed boxes of documents. Inside the first box, Corbin found testimonies written by household servants from the era, each describing strange occurrences connected to an unnamed young woman. One report described symbols appearing in frost. Another recounted objects moving without human touch. But what struck Corbin most was that all the testimonies ended abruptly, often mid-sentence, as if the writers had been interrupted and never allowed to return to their work. Some documents were charred at the edges, suggesting they had narrowly escaped being burned entirely. When Corbin asked the judge why these documents had been hidden, the old man smiled without warmth and said his grandfather believed certain stories were better left buried. He added that several witnesses who tried to record what they had seen had disappeared, some vanishing from their homes in the middle of the night, others dying unexpectedly with no clear cause. Their statements were collected only because the judge's grandfather believed it was vital to preserve truth, even if the rest of the city wanted to erase it. But he had kept the documents hidden afterward, refusing to let anyone read them until long after his death. Corbin's obsession deepened with each discovery. He spent evenings interviewing elderly residents who remembered fragments of the old rumors. Most refused to speak openly, lowering their voices whenever they mentioned the young woman, as though someone or something still listened. A trembling man in his 80s claimed that his father had attended the forbidden auction and returned home a changed man, unable to sleep, haunted by the girl's unblinking stare. A former servant recounted how her grandmother used to warn children not to walk near the riverbank at night because the woman who walked without footsteps might be looking for her lost past. None of the stories matched perfectly, but each carried the same sense of unease, the same suggestion that whatever had happened in 1840 had left a scar on the city's memory. Corbin eventually stumbled upon a locked drawer in the parish library containing several censored police reports. The librarian insisted the drawer was never meant to be accessed, yet curiosity overcame caution. Inside, he found 3 reports written by officers who had been called to investigate disturbances in homes connected to the girl. Each report described impossible occurrences: walls vibrating without movement, shadows gathering in corners without a light source, and symbols etched into surfaces that no human hand could have reached. One officer wrote that he saw the girl standing at the end of a hallway, her eyes reflecting something that made him feel as though he were drowning. Yet when he blinked, she vanished. He resigned the following morning and moved upriver, leaving behind no forwarding address. The deeper Corbin delved, the more he sensed that something resisted his progress. Documents he had read one day went missing the next. Pages he had copied seemed to blur when he revisited them, ink fading as though erased by an unseen hand. The archivist grew increasingly nervous as he returned again and again to the restricted records, finally begging him to leave the matter alone. She whispered that some archives were sealed not by law, but by fear, a fear passed down through generations, not because of superstition, but because of experience. Despite the resistance, Corbin persisted until he uncovered one final piece. A ledger from the late 1840s referencing a group of men who had attempted to track the young woman after her last disappearance. Their pursuit ended abruptly at the edge of the bayou, where they claimed she had walked into the water without sinking, the surface rippling as though opening to receive her. The ledger ended there, written in shaky script, as if the writer had seen something that shattered whatever logic he once trusted. Corbin realized that every layer of secrecy, every missing testimony, every burned note pointed to the same conclusion. Those who witnessed the girl's presence had tried to document her, but each attempt ended in silence, disappearance, or destruction. The city had not forgotten her out of convenience. It had buried her story out of necessity, afraid that uncovering too much might stir something that had never truly left. What she carried within her was not a secret born from misfortune or suffering, but something far older, something woven into her very being long before she ever stood beneath the torches of that forbidden auction. The truth of her existence was rooted in ancient traditions that the men of New Orleans had no language for, traditions passed through generations across vast oceans, carried in whispers, songs, and symbols meant for those who understood the invisible worlds walking beside the living. Her markings, the strange rhythm of her voice, the unexplainable disturbances that followed her, all were fragments of a lineage deeply connected to spiritual forces her captors could neither comprehend nor control. To them, she appeared as an enigma, an anomaly, a rare possession to be purchased and owned. But what they failed to grasp was that she carried a power old enough to make the living tremble and the dead stir from their rest. Long before her arrival in New Orleans, the land she came from held stories about individuals chosen not by birthright, but by something the ancestors called the hidden spirit, a presence believed to inhabit certain souls, guiding them, protecting them, and revealing itself only when threatened. The elders of her homeland taught that such individuals were bridges between worlds, carrying voices from beyond the physical realm. These chosen ones bore markings that surfaced during adolescence, lines and patterns that seemed to glow when the spirit within them stirred. Among her people, she would have been watched over, mentored, and protected. But fate tore her from that path and placed her in a world that sought not to honor, but to own her. The secret she carried began to show its true shape the moment she was taken from her homeland. Witnesses in the ports recounted strange occurrences that followed her arrival, though their accounts were dismissed as superstition. Lantern flames bent toward her when she passed. Birds fell silent, watching her with unnatural stillness. Two sailors who attempted to restrain her claimed they felt an overwhelming heaviness press against their chests, as though invisible hands were warning them to retreat. And yet, none of these signs were recognized for what they were. The men around her saw only a young woman with unusual traits, unaware that her spirit had awakened in defense the moment she was forced into the world of chains. By the time she reached New Orleans, the secret had already begun to reshape itself. Her presence unsettled the city, not because she wished to harm it, but because the spiritual force within her reacted instinctively to the fear, greed, and violence surrounding her. The disturbances in the homes she entered were not conscious acts. They were manifestations of a guardian force responding to the intentions of those who tried to claim her as property. The vibrations in the walls, the symbols appearing in frost, the shifting shadows, these were the language of the hidden spirit, warnings meant for those too blinded by desire to understand them. What they perceived as curses were protections. What they believed to be supernatural attacks were boundaries drawn by something ancient, urging those who approached her with hunger for power to step back. As Corbin pieced together testimonies decades later, he began to understand that the young woman's secret was not one of witchcraft or malevolence. It was an old truth buried beneath generations of fear and misunderstanding. One of the preserved testimonies described her speaking softly to an empty corner of a room, her tone calm, reverent. The witness swore the shadows in that corner thickened and trembled, as though answering her. Another account described her sitting beneath the moonlight, her markings glowing with a faint golden pulse as she sang a melody too ancient to be traced. The wind outside the house shifted in unnatural currents, rising and falling in rhythm with her voice. These were not signs of darkness, but of connection to something deeper than the physical world, something her ancestors believed existed alongside every living being. Her presence in New Orleans disrupted the city not because she brought an evil force with her, but because the spiritual energy she carried resisted the intentions of those who sought to dominate her. In her homeland, such energy was understood and respected. In the auction houses and mansions of New Orleans, it became a threat to the balance of power. The men who tried to claim her believed they were dealing with a rare possession, a curiosity that needed to be tamed. Instead, they found themselves standing before a force that recognized their intentions instinctively and responded without hesitation. Those with cruel hearts experienced fear, confusion, and unexplained terror. Those with greed felt the presence around her grow heavier, pressing against their ambitions until they cracked under its weight. There were accounts in Corbin's research that suggested she could sense the hidden truths within people. Servants who treated her with quiet dignity reported feeling a strange peace when she looked at them, as though the air grew lighter. Others who approached her with suspicion or cruelty described sudden nightmares, unexplained illnesses, or the eerie sensation of being watched even when alone. The hidden spirit within her did not seek vengeance, it sought balance. But in a world built on imbalance, such power became a fracture point that terrified those who depended on domination to maintain their status. The final piece of the secret emerged from the ledger Corbin discovered near the end of his research, the one describing her last known moments. The men who tracked her claimed she walked into the bayou willingly, the water parting around her legs as though acknowledging her presence. Some swore the surface of the water rippled in patterns that matched the marks on her arms. Others claimed they heard a low chant echoing through the trees, coming from no identifiable direction. The girl did not drown. She simply moved deeper into the marsh until the mist consumed her, and the water stilled behind her without a trace. To the men who watched, it was an impossibility, an act that defied every law they knew. But to those who understood the law of her homeland, it was a return to the spirit that had always protected her. Corbin realized that the impossible secret she carried was not a curse, but a guardianship, an inheritance meant to be honored, not feared. Her connection to the ancient world had clashed with the greed and violence of those who believed they could possess her, creating disturbances that echoed through decades. Her disappearance into the bayou was not an escape, but a reclamation, a merging of her spirit and the natural world that had refused to abandon her. And though the city tried to bury her story, the traces of her presence remained in the places she touched, lingering in the shadows, reminding anyone who ventured too close that some spirits walk with a purpose no chain can contain.